Welcome to the debate. So today we're tackling a really fundamental topic, the international economic system. I mean, we're talking about the big players, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and this growing sense that they're facing a profound crisis of legitimacy. Geopolitical shifts, rising protectionism, it all feeds into this.
And I think that confrontation is long overdue. The core tension we're examining today is, whether these established institutions, which were modeled largely by Western powers after World War II, are fundamentally salvageable through, let's say, incremental reform, or if their structural asymmetries and just inherent biases are so profound that they demand a radical, normative reimagining, as is now being called for by the Global South.
Right. And my position is that these institutions remain, well, essential. They're cornerstones of global financial stability and cooperation. They provide this non-negotiable platform for multilateral negotiation. And yes, they absolutely must be adapted to current global market conditions, but abandoning them risks fragmenting the entire global economic order.
And I'll be arguing the opposing view, that these institutions are, by their very design, instruments of what could be called global financial hegemony. Their structures reflect and perpetuate a kind of economic neocolonialism. We've seen decades of these incremental reforms prove insufficient because the system itself is, frankly, structurally obsolete. It requires a foundational shift toward equity to survive.
Okay, so maybe let's begin with the historical record because I think that context it's critical here. The Bretton Woods institutions weren't simply designed to enrich a few nations. They were pivotal in institutionalizing multilateralism and promoting global stability after a period of, catastrophic economic nationalism and war.
Well, that was the stated rationale, yes? Born out of the consensus of a very small number of dominant nations at the time.
And they delivered genuine stability. I mean, the IMF was created specifically to stabilize international monetary affairs, offering temporary financial assistance to prevent countries from resorting to competitive devaluations. The World Bank directed long-term credit. This framework was effective, and we have concrete evidence of that success. The combined efforts of these institutions contributed to a vast expansion of global wealth. World trade grew at nearly double the rate of world production between 1950 and 1975, all facilitated by the liberalization that they championed. This wasn't minor growth. It created the very framework for globalized prosperity.
Prosperity that was, let's be honest, disproportionately concentrated in the industrialized North, and it was fueled by the capital and labor of the South. I acknowledge the creation of a framework, but we have to interrogate whose interest that framework was really designed to serve. The system is structurally asymmetric. It's a textbook example of what's called structural power.
Okay, so define that. What do you mean by structural power in this specific context?
Structural power is the ability to set the fundamental rules and norms of the game itself. It ensures that even if you make some short-term policy concessions, the long-term outcomes consistently favor the dominant players, and we see this manifested directly in the governance structure, which creates a glaring democratic deficit. I mean, just consider the voting power asymmetry. The structure heavily privileges the West, culminating in the U.S. having an effective veto at the IMF. And of course, the World Bank presidency has been an uninterrupted monopoly held by Americans. This isn't an accident. It embeds Western dominance in every decision. For many in the Global South, these institutions are perceived not unfairly as structures designed to serve the interests of TNCs, banks, and investment firms in a new imperial age.
But surely we have to concede that the institutions have demonstrated an ability to adapt mechanisms, both to align with integrated global markets and to address emerging crises. They are far more nimble now than they were decades ago, responding to things like the environment and global data flows.
Operationally, yes, they have evolved, but not representationally. That core asymmetry persists, and this is precisely why the demand for a new international economic order, the NIEO, emerged back in the 1970s. It was a recognition that existing organizations just weren't addressing the widening disparities. The NIEO wasn't just asking for better aid. It advocated for a system founded on equity and sovereign equality. That challenge, that ontological challenge, to the very nature of the order, is still painfully relevant today because the power structure has barely budged.
That brings us to a really critical area of disagreement, which is the effects of policy intervention. I understand the critique of systemic bias, but we have to discuss how the institutions function in practice when countries are in crisis.
And that practice often takes the form of conditionality, and I fundamentally disagree with framing these lending practices as simply enforcing good governance. Their conditionalities are more often than not criticized for prioritizing harsh fiscal consolidation that immediately translates into austerity-induced social costs for the most vulnerable.
I would frame the function of conditionality differently. It is certainly difficult, but emergency credit, it demands accountability. It ensures that the emergency funding is not misused and that the borrowing country corrects the underlying macroeconomic imbalances. It promotes fiscal responsibility and the rule of law over the long term.
I just don't see it that way. The conditionalities are often a mechanism of discipline rather than a lever for sustainable development. I mean, look at recent history, the crises in Sri Lanka or Pakistan. Loan conditions demand welfare cuts, removal of key subsidies, public sector wage freezes. This erodes domestic policy autonomy. It essentially forces sovereign nations to prioritize external debt servicing over their own internal social stability, which often leads to popular protest and deeper political fragility. This is structural adjustment enforced from the outside.
You are focusing on the painful, immediate consequences. And they are real, I grant you that. But you're ignoring the broader mandate and the adaptive capacity of these institutions. We can't overlook the significant collaboration between the IMF and World Bank that demonstrates a commitment to poverty reduction beyond just discipline.
And what evidence of that commitment is strong enough to outweigh that structural coercion you just heard me describe?
Well, consider an initiative like HIPC, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. That was facilitated jointly, and it provided comprehensive debt relief to dozens of the world's poorest nations. It wiped out billions in debt, contingent on a national commitment to poverty reduction goals, or the PRSP approach, Poverty Reduction Strategy Papers, which shifted development policy to link national policies directly to jointly agreed-upon development outcomes. That represents a significant shift away from the top-down punitive approach of the 80s.
Sure, but HIPC was an acknowledgement of failure. It was a necessary cleanup operation after decades of unsustainable debt accumulation under the existing system. And while the PRSP approach sounds collaborative, the power asymmetry remains. The institution still ultimately holds the purse strings and sets the surveillance framework, so the national policies still have to align with the creditor's definitions of development outcomes which, often remain centered on market liberalization. And this leads me to my next point, institutional relevance. Why should we prop up an architecture that is demonstrating such deep structural failure? I'm not convinced that simply maintaining this is the way forward.
But that architecture provides the only reliable multilateral platform we have. The WTO, which evolved from GATT, remains the cornerstone of trade resolution because of its robust rulebook and its historic dispute settlement mechanism. If we abandon this, we risk accelerating the trend toward protectionism and unilateral trade actions, which inevitably hurt smaller economies the most. The WTO is meant to level the playing field with rules like most favored nation treatment.
I disagree that the field is level, and frankly, the WTO's credibility is already severely diminished. The system is structurally compromised. I mean, when powerful states decide to challenge the very rules they helped create, the system collapses. We see this with the appellate body, the so-called Supreme Court of Global Trade. It has been paralyzed since 2019 because the U.S. blocked the appointment of new judges. So when the mechanism for enforcing the rules stops working, the system ceases to be a cornerstone. It becomes a hollow shell.
Okay, but that paralysis is a political failing of member states. It's not a flaw in the MFN principle itself. The foundational principles of non-discrimination are still sound.
But the inability to enforce the rules is a structural flaw in governance. It shows the rules only bind those who lack the geopolitical leverage to ignore them. And this is exactly why we're seeing emerging economies actively developing alternatives. The rise of institutions like the BRICS New Development Bank, the AIIB, this reflects a strategic, material shift.
And what specifically is the strategic significance of those alternatives? They are focused primarily on infrastructure lending, aren't they?
Their significance is ideological and structural. They are demonstrating that viable alternatives to Western-dominated structures can and do exist, and they often operate without the weighting voting structures of the World Bank or IMF. They're reflecting a conscious decision to move from norm compliance with Western structures to norm creation, creating new rules for global finance that prioritize their own needs. This puts immense pressure on the Bretton Woods institutions, proving that the old system is not indispensable.
I agree that the emergence of the NDB and AIB exerts pressure, I do. But are they comprehensive enough to replace the full range of functions the BWIs perform? I mean, from global financial surveillance to trade dispute resolution and setting monetary standards, that network took decades to build.
Replacement is a long-term goal, perhaps. But the immediate challenge is ontological. The Global South is demanding a reshaping of the rules to achieve economic justice. This means addressing massive issues the BWIs have ignored or made worse, like agricultural subsidies in developed nations that systematically harm developing country farmers. It means setting fair provisions for digital trade that don't just benefit a handful of tech giants. Without this fundamental shift toward equity, toward reducing these alarming disparities, the institutions will just continue to perpetuate the structural inequalities that created this crisis in the first place.
That's a compelling argument for radical change. But have you considered that substantial, rather than wholesale reform, is the more pragmatic and an achievable path? The path of adaptation minimizes global instability while addressing these legitimacy concerns through collective action.
But pragmatism hasn't solved the core asymmetry in 50 years. Why would it now?
Because the collective advocacy of the Global South is now strong enough to enforce meaningful change within the system. Major emerging economies are leading this charge. India, for instance, advocates strongly for inclusive reforms inside the WTO, stressing the retention of special and differential treatment, SDT, and supporting a revamped but fair dispute mechanism. They are not advocating for abandonment. Furthermore, the G20, which includes these economies, is heavily focused on reforming the international financial institutions. This political pressure offers a structured, coordinated way to address critical issues like IMF quota shares without losing the entire framework. It balances aspiration with the need for order.
The problem is that path is perpetually obstructed by the deep-seated resistance of the very nations who benefit most from the status quo. The U.S. reluctance to cede quota shares is the perfect example. As Thomas Wise rightly argues, incremental reform is insufficient when institutional architecture itself is obsolete. The NIEO demands restructuring and forming new institutions to truly regulate capital flows for the benefit of all, ensuring sovereign control rather than just adjusting the window dressing.
I acknowledge the legitimate critiques regarding governance and policy impact. Historically, however, these institutions have provided stability, order, and a shared framework of non-discrimination that has underpinned global growth. The pragmatic path forward is through enhancing their adaptive capacities and pursuing difficult but necessary reforms, like revamping the appellate body to truly reflect 21st century realities and ensure the principles of multilateral cooperation endure.
And I maintain that the core issues we face stem from deep-seated structural asymmetries that reinforce global financial hegemony. Unless developed nations accept a fundamental shift in power and policy that prioritizes development, equity, and sovereign equality, the principles of the NIEO movement, these institutions will continue to face a legitimacy crisis. They risk becoming increasingly irrelevant and marginalized amid the rising tide of plurilateral alternatives, which are already creating new norms outside the Western-dominated framework.
The debate really highlights that while the consensus on adaptation is necessary, the fundamental disagreement lies in whether the existing institutional architecture can truly support the economic justice and representation now demanded by a more complex, multipolar world, without sacrificing essential global stability.
And whether those who benefit from the current rules are willing to sacrifice short-term power for the long-term goal of a truly equitable and sustainable global order.
Indeed. Thank you for that rigorous exchange.